Welcome back. Let's go over routing in more detail in this section. Now, Next.js uses a file-based router. That is, anytime you create a new file inside the pages directory, you can automatically route to it based on its file name. But there is a lot more to routing. And before we dive into the different types of routing that Next.js provides, let's take a look at what routing even is. Let's take a step back. Our browser provides us with something called as a history API. Now, essentially what we are trying to do with routing is that anytime you type something in your URL, we want a specific page to load. That is a gist of what routing is. Now, with the history API that the browser provides, we can essentially navigate the user back and forth between different pages. And browser provides us with this API so that we can manipulate the content of the user's history. But the reality is that this specific API is not readable and it is quite complex. So when we were building React applications without Next.js, we might have heard of a popular library called React Router. Now there are different routing libraries for React apps in general, but React Router is one of the most popular ones. React Router, it gives you a more readable API on top of the history API. It gives you components, so you can configure your routes and which pages will those routes point to. But internally, React Router does use the history API as well. Similarly, Next.js provides us with a file-based routing system, but Next.js also uses the history API internally to route back and forth. Now, Next.js has made it even more simpler for us because all we need to do is create a new file. But now there are different ways of creating routes in Next.js. Let's take a look. Next.js provides us three different ways. One being the index routes, second the nested routes, and third the dynamic routes. Let's take a look at index routes. In our application in the pages directory, index.js is that index-based route. So anytime you create a new file and call it index.js under the pages directory, that file automatically becomes a default route within that directory. So in this case, index.js is essentially a React component. And if I go back to the browser, in this specific app, if I enter /, this is that default route itself. But we need to remember that there are two rules of routing. Now, for this specific routing to work, we need to do two things. What are those? We need to make sure that the page is a React component. That is, this specific page is actually a React component. It returns JSX. It returns a React component so that the browser can render it accordingly. And second, we need to make sure that the component needs to be exported by default. That is, in this case, we are exporting this specific function by default. And that's what we want. Without that, Next.js is not going to understand that this is a default page. So if I remove default from this specific file and go back to the browser and hit refresh, you will notice that it complains that the default export is not a React component in /page. And that's because it's no longer a default component. I'm going back to how it was. And now if I go back, you will see that it has automatically rendered. And that is the beauty of the default routing. All right, I'll see you in the next one where we will go over nested routes.